Okay, so we've been looking at Blender for about 6 weeks now. We're on week 7 now. Most of you turned in your sofa projects, and on the whole, they're looking great. Few discrepancies between a couple of them, but that's fine. 6 weeks in, very very pleased with the way things are going. However, we have been watching chat over the last couple of weeks, and mainly in doing so, we've been able to identify some areas where some people are kind of struggling or not understanding quite something that we've done. And I thought that this week, since we've now all got a little bit of experience in Blender under our belts, it might be a good idea to go back and revisit some of these fundamentals. Well, not even fundamentals, some of it is kind of complex or technical, but revisit some of this and get a clearer idea of what we're doing and, more importantly, why we're doing it. Okay, so I've got a little list here, just scanning through to see which ones we shall tackle first. And I think the first one we're going to tackle is some people are confused about what views they should be working in. Basically, these tabs up the top. Okay, so when we first open Blender default, it comes into a layout tab, and the layout tab is in object mode. The difference between a layout tab and, say, something like UV editing is our screen on the layout tab, our 3D screen, is taking up the full screen. This allows us more kind of screen real estate to see what we're working on. Now the next one is a modeling tab. Now, as I said, layout tab is in object mode by default. If we go into modeling tab, it goes into edit mode, and it also goes into a non-textured view. We can of course texture this view by pressing the look dev button here. So basically between modeling and layout now, they're virtually the same views, except one is in edit mode and one is in object. Layout being object. I could of course tab into object mode or into edit mode in the layout, and I could of course tab into object mode in the modeling. It really doesn't matter. These two are pretty much the same. The only differences are the default object and edit mode, and the default solid and textured mode or look dev mode. Okay, pretty much the same thing. Right, so when you're working on your models and you want the biggest view possible of your 3D scene, use layout and modeling. I tend to use modeling rather than layout because they are so similar. I just tend to use modeling all the time, and then I can tab in and out of edit mode. I can select my other object, tab into edit mode, tab into object mode, and even though the default is solid, it's very very easy just to put your textures on once they are applied, just by going from solid view to look dev. While we're on views, we also have the wireframe view. Okay, so my selected object is in orange. For example, if I select the physics there, you can see those clearer. Or if I select this backdrop. Okay, I don't use wireframe a lot. There are reasons to, and times when you do need to, but generally 99% of the time I'm using a solid or a look dev view. And the final view of course is the rendered view, which will give us an idea of what it's all going to look like when it's baked once it all comes around. That's taking very long. I'm in cycles. Okay, it's coming up. But 99% of the time you're going to be working in either solid view or look dev. Okay, so that's layout and modeling. Sculpting we haven't come to yet. Sculpting is for using brushes and stuff to help shape your models. It comes in this default kind of red, but we won't worry about sculpting too much now. The other three we have been using are the next three: UV editing, texture paint, and shading. Okay. UV editing and texture paint are very similar in that one half of your screen has the model view and the other half has what looks like a texture view. But it's not texture view, it's actually UV paint. Not UV paint, UV editing. I should have been UV editing. It's UV editor. Okay. So although they look similar, they're not always. One common problem we've been seeing is when people are in object mode and they say, I can't see my UVs, I can't select everything. It's because you're in object mode. To see your UVs, you have to be in edit mode. Okay? And then your UVs will show up. If you haven't unwrapped yet, they'll all be it'll look blank. Because all the points are on top of one another. But after you've unwrapped, you'll see your UVs. Okay. Now then there comes a problem between selecting the UVs and between the screens. So, for example, if I unselect everything, I'm not seeing anything. Okay. If I go into a face select here and start selecting a couple of faces, you'll see that the UVs are starting to appear. So, if you've got nothing selected, you won't see anything on the UV editor. Okay. You can if you use the sync button, and then it will select on both sides, but the sync button will show the entire UV. You can see here we've got the palettes here as well as the pillows. The other thing about sync button is you lose the ability for the island select. So when sync's on, you cannot select an island because you haven't got an island. Whereas with sync off, I could say select all here. I could use my island select to select this pillow. No, I'm actually selecting the palettes. This pillow, there we go. So then I could grab that pillow and move it on my UV. Okay. So most of the time I will work with sync mode off. So I've got this ability to select islands. Okay. And so that's sync and that's the islands. When we've got nothing selected, we see nothing. We will see it with a sync view. But generally, I prefer to work with my UVs in this non-sync mode. Which brings us... Oh, right. Okay, that's before we go. The background texture. You can see I've got my ones that I already had here. So, for example, if I was to add a new texture, let's just call this test. Okay, I've got my test texture selected, still do the same thing. I can see my islands, doesn't really matter, it's not going to affect, but we select the texture that we're going to use for the UV. So for example, my initial texture was this floral texture, which is that one, which is moved on my hard disk. So I'd have to find that again. But anyway, if we go back to floor, let's go back to the floor. No, go back to the pillows. You can see that we can select the islands or the faces from the model on the UV. Okay, how does this differ from texture paint? They're very similar. Well, texture paint is really for drawing on your model. So for example, if I was to use a green brush here and I was to start painting here, you see it coming up on the texture here, over here. Let me just Control Z or Z backwards, because I don't want texture paint. I don't want to paint over this lovely texture. So texture paint is something we can use and we will learn more about. but for most of the time we're working in UV editing. Okay. And then finally, what we've learnt so far is the shading tab, which brings up our shaders down here. This one's a little bit messy because I was showing colours there. Now that pink's missing, which is that floral texture again. 1 second, let me find this floral texture. There we go. I had moved it on my hard disk so Blender couldn't find it. This is where we set up our materials and our shaders. Okay. One thing a lot of people were having trouble finding, let me delete those, is when they press Control T, they weren't getting these extra 2 nodes. Okay. The reason for that is because you don't have your node wrangler set up in preferences. So to make sure we do that now, so we've got it moving forward, we go to Edit Preferences, we go to Add-ons, and if you type in Node Wrangler, we'll start to, you'll get the Node Wrangler selection. Make sure that this is enabled. Save your preferences. So after that, every time you go to add this mapping texture, you select your input texture, Control T, and you've got these. Okay. So those are the views that we use most of the time, the tabs that we will use.